Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Today we will discuss a module from the paper Indian Aesthetics, and this module is on Bhalchandra Nemade and his idea of Nativism. In his book Nemade, the book is Nativism or Deshivad. Nemade writes a line that there is no East and no West, all is global. And problem lies here. He begins this idea of nativism from this theoretical problem. In this era of globalization, it is very often argued that no cultural or literary elements are nativist, rather, they are global. Immense growth of technology and people's access to it no doubt offers a knowledge of different cultural zones of the world. Neoliberal economy successfully has commercialized cultural products of different regions and circulated those to the other parts of the world. But this is partial or very limited observation. It is not astonishing that all the parts of the globe is not equally represented in this era of immense technological growth. People, culture, and the communities survive with their past, with their indigenous and traditional cultural beliefs and systems in different forms. If such practices do not happen so materially, it still exists in collective memory of the communities. The point here is the concept of globalization and the concept of the nativism is not exactly opposite to each other, opposite to ideas, and one does not ensure the absence of the other. To understand nativism in culture, language, or literature, we have to understand the historical development of one literature and its contemporary or current trends. But globalization is not only force which makes people skeptical about locating the nativity in a certain cultural system, but there were whole lot of other epistemological forces and what have already changed the lives, thoughts, and practices of the communities, such as colonialism, imperialism, modernism, etc. In different periods of history, such experiences challenged the nativist practices of the communities who have come across the historical phenomena. Now, let us talk about the birth of the concept of nativism. In America, in 1835 to 1845, the concept of Americanism was emerged, which was the parent idea of giving birth the idea of nativism, native plus ism. Nativism as a concept was introduced in India during 1980s. It was introduced in India through English in India. Bhalchandra Nemade, pioneer theorist of nativism or Desivad, says, I quote, the task of preparing again a viable Indian critical tradition may not be possible unless all the systems of literature, productive, distributive, and consumptive are originally desi or nativistic. Unquote. The colonialism and restricting of Indian culture during this era of British Raj unanimously described Indian culture as low value culture. Nemade correctly established the point of beginning of his discussion in saying that it had been certainly a high value culture till the 17th century, which created Darashiko, the Tej, and Tukaram, to mention only a few. I unquote. So Nemade's point is the Indian culture was high culture in ancient period. It was high culture in medieval period, and it was high culture in pre-colonial era. And India gave birth of highly mature talent in poetry, in prose, in grammar, in philosophy, in science, and in other epistemological thoughts, in writing the Rasa Sahitya or Romantic Sahitya literature and other genres of literature. And the translators. India had very talented translators of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in every nook and corner of India. India had a very talented literary figures in Bhakti movement or in medieval era. India had very good, efficient translator like the translator of Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavata, Purana, and the translator like Darashiko. So when it is considered as local culture, when the India encountered with British or the European cultural and knowledge hegemony started to oppress the Indian indigenous ideas of religion, philosophy, history, and literature. Now let us talk about the definition of nativism. What is nativism? Nativism is a policy or practice or idea of preserving or carrying one's culture in which she or he finds history of his or her ancestors. The policy of protecting the interest of native inhabitants against those of immigrants. This is very contemporary or modern idea of nativism because the immigration in Europe and immigration in US creates a political problem in European and American concept. So nativism as an idea is actually reshaped in contemporary time to show the immigrants as other and who do not have a right to the land where they have been immigrated. The theory that humans are biologically equipped with a knowledge of certain universal elements of language structure that is brought into play in the course of native language acquisition. So nativism is understood from the perspective of language also, and Chomsky has brilliant works on this. Oxford Dictionary, available at oxforddictionary.com, it defines nativism as a return to or emphasis on indigenous custom in opposition to outside influence. Yourdictionary.com defines nativism as the revival or preservation of a native culture. Webster's Dictionary, available at the Merriam-Webster dictionary.com, it defines nativism as the revival or perpetuation of an indigenous culture, especially in opposition to acculturation. Online dictionary, available at dictionary.reference.com, it puts nativism as the policy or practice of preserving or reviving an indigenous culture. The University Desk Encyclopedia defines nativism as turning in of a country or society towards its own culture through movements rejecting foreign influence. Next. Rejecting foreign influences, ideas, or immigrants. World English Dictionary available at the dictionary.reference. It defines nativism as the policy of protecting and reforming native tribal cultures in reaction to acculturation. So, from this definition, we can understand that nativism is preserving one's culture, finding out one's history of ancestors, establishing one's unique identity, which is not accultured, which is not globalized, which is not international. So, nativism can be observed in contemporary time from different perspectives. From the European native perspectives, what observe the immigrants as other. From the American native perspective, what observe the immigrants as or migrated people as others. We can observe nativism from the tribal perspective, that the tribals are the original people of the land, and the Aryans or other communities, they actually invaded the land. So the nativism is actually preserving the culture, language, and the whole identity, economy, religion of the native people, which have been facing threats since last thousands or more years, and especially it faced threats in with the European invasion in different countries, different tribal lands of India, of Africa, Latin America, and America. And we can observe that this nativism also kind of impossible action, because the globalization has such capturing power over the different indigenous communities. But why then nativism? Because in spite of being oppressed or surrounded or being into net by the globalized culture or neoliberal culture, or this immense growth of technology, we have to find, we means that any community have to find their history, their identity, their place of origin, their original culture, and they have to revival their own history to combat with the monolingual cacophony, with the monocultural assertions. Now let us talk about Bhalchandra Nemade, who actually elaborated, theorized the idea of nativism in Indian context, and who initiated this discussion on nativism with his writing in Marathi in early 1980s. Bhalchandra Nemade was born in 1938, and he is a Marathi writer from Maharashtra. He is famous for his books Hindu and Kosala. Eminent Marathi literature Bhalchandra Nemade, whose 1963 novel Kosala or Cocoon changed the dimension of Marathi novel. It was on Friday selected for 2014 Gyanpith Award, the highest literary honor in India by the Gyanpith Selection Board. Nemade is the fourth Marathi writer to win the Gyanpith Award, this literary honor. And after the V.S. Khandekar in 1974, V.V. Shirvadkar and alias Kushumagaraj in 1988, and Govind Karandikar alias Vinda Karandikar in 2003. I quote, novelist, poet, critic, academic, and a relentless advocate of the literary movement and the leader of the post-1960s Little Magazine movement, Nemade has inscribed his name prominently in the annals of Indian literature, especially for offering this theoretical understanding of nativism in his book Nativism or Deshibad, because this is observed as the text of post-colonial studies, a text of anti-colonial movement against the colonial thought and the colonial philosophy and the colonial methodology of practicing knowledge. And this is one of the literary thought or philosophical thought what is unique in India, in the sense that after colonialism or colonization, India couldn't have produced original literary thought except the Dalitism or Dalit literary theory. Nemade's contribution to the literary form of the novel are peerless. Not only was Khosla instrumental in changing the dimension of the Marathi novel, but the world of Marathi fiction was transformed with its advent. The mega novel Hindu, published in 2010, appears to match this feat that Khosla achieved over 5 decades ago, the statement says in the Hindu newspaper. Nemade's famous book Nativism or Desivad is published from Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla in 2009. The chapters of the books are as follows: Preface, Nativism in Literary Culture; Modernity, Globalization and Nativism; Native Styles, Orality; Marathi Novels 1857 to 1975; The Story of Yogananda in the Kathasarit Sagara; Arun Kolatkar, and Bilingual Poetry. So these chapters in his books gives us a glimpse to get into the idea of nativism. And it is also noteworthy to mention here that Bhalchandra Nemade is not only a theorist, not only a literary figure, but he is trained linguist. So such kind of work get richness because of his training and his knowledge in variety. First, let us consider Deshivad or nativism. Nemade seems to popularize this new concept in Marathi criticism. He tells us that Deshivad is a translation of English term nativism, which means that while alleging that Marathi criticism is overly dependent on English, and this case we can find in case of any other modern Indian literature, that modern Indian literature is studied from the perspective of European or American, mostly European literary theories. So Nemade himself is borrowing from this idea from English, and be that as it may, what is more important according to him is that the term nativism is used in anthropology. We have not come across that this concept was ever widely used or in use today in Western literary discourse, which means that Nemade is trying to make Marathi criticism swallow an anthropological point of view of criticism in the course of the essay. Nemade refers to genes, Darwin, and also cites the example of giraffe's long neck, which means Nemade views literature through the glasses of anthropology, genetics, and zoology, or the theory of evolution. This is not a new point of view for analyzing literature, and by now its limitations have also been exposed. Exactly the same kind of inspiration was behind Emile Zola's concept of naturalism. Secondly, anthropologists probably study the sensibility of nativism as a matter of curiosity. But the author of this piece, from where I am quoting, but I doubt if they endorse it as an evaluative tool. The author's doubt is that. And author tells that Nemade seems to be taking a quantum jump by applying this concept to literature, more so by endorsing it as a literary value. But he cannot justify this jump just by pointing his finger at anthropology. For this purpose, it is necessary to scrutinize the concept in the context of what constitutes greatness in literature and literary values. It is disputable whether any literature benefits simply by the application of the concept of nativism, and the author of this piece do not think Nemade can claim to know any decisive answer. For that purpose, it would be necessary to study literary histories of different countries from a comparative point of view. Though Nemade talks about comparative literature in this context, and the author whose comments I am quoting here also in support of comparative methodology in studying literature to get new literary theory of analyzing literature. More often, it is found that when a literary tradition abandoned its parochial nativism and narrow nationalism and adopted the attitude of the honeybee, it flourished vibrantly. I unquote, and this piece is taken from the Muse India Journal. Now, let us go into the concept of nativism. I quote, the concept of nativism appears to consist of two constituents held together in a dialectical relationship, the self and other. When in European or American context, we are talking about nativism, we are talking about immigrants as other. So there is a self who has sole authority on the land. So the others who are coming for the other countries are immigrants and they are other. And so the concept of native or nativism emerged very in high manner. The self is a whole with which a Deshi identifies himself or herself, almost fluctuating boundaries where a community has evolved a relatively stable form of life over a stretch of time, a common mode of production, a common matrix of religious, social, moral, artistic practices, a common belief structure, language, a shared history are commonly taken as indicators of a form of life that has been evolved. It is not necessary that all the indicators must be present, but it is expected that many of them should be. The other is that which is appreciably different from the self on many of the above points. The relation between the two can be one of peaceful coexistence, but often it is conceived to be a power relation, not a relation between differents but of opposites. One community forcibly tries to bring about changes in another community. The relation obviously becomes a power relation, I unquote. And these things we exactly observe during colonial era or during the time of different imperialism. And this is observed in contemporary time of neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism, where the whole world, whole earth is imagined as global community. Here it should be remembered that nativism is not an obsession with roots. Instead, it is a concept which has come to challenge the very idea of Eurocentric modernism and internationalism. The tendency to compare every literary text or trend with some Euro-American product, as said by Indranath Chaudhuri in his welcome address speech at a seminar on Desivad in Indian literature organized by Sahitya Academy in collaboration with the Center for Creative Writing and Publication, IIT Kanpur in 1995. Makarand Paranjape defines nativism as a form of indigenous whose agenda can be summed up as a cry for cultural self-respect. He described it as a militant or aggressive form of the passive and self-evident quality of nativeness. He also calls it the value of being native. It is the value which is inherent in any cultural object, belief, or practice. It implies the natural state of sustaining the status quo. Nativism is, thus, for Bhalchandra Nemade, establishing of one's right to exist as one is. Now let us talk why we need nativism. Why do we need it? Kalidasa is the Shakespeare of India, or Valmiki is the Homer of the East. All these foreign signifiers become a primary base of our linguistic science in literary criticism. But who was the Tukaram of West? Nemade asked. Or what was the Ajanta or the Mahabharata of the West? Each culture has its Deshi modernity or native modernity. Being native means being attached to a particular place. When we talk about Indian modernity, we not only talk about a singular or single modernity, we talk about colonial modernity, alternative modernity, indigenous modernity, and several other kinds of modernity. Even there is difference between the modernity and the concept of adhunik or adhunikata. In Bangla, we can find several words equivalent to modern or modernity, and those are the adhunikata, nobbo, etc. What are discussed thoroughly and theorized in Partho Chatterjee's book on Empire and Nation. So, if there are different kinds of modernity, and it implies that nativism or native identity exists there in the concept of modernities. According to Tagore, what he said in Adhunik Kabbo or modern poetry, he said that while literature take a bend, a remarkable bend, that is modern. So modern exists in past, modern exists in present and in contemporary time. So we have different modernities in our literary history. To nativistic in order to survive. So why we have to be nativistic? Because we have to survive. We have to save our culture, our identity, and our history of our root, our originality. Native principle is fundamental to literature, and this native idea will come for our literary practice. Literature is a record of our native history. The regional may be thought of only as subset of the nativist. So nativism is not necessarily means the regionalism or regional identity. Regional identity is a subset of whole idea of nativism. According to Makarand Paranjape, Deshivad or nativism is a militant or aggressive form of that passive and self-evident quality of Deshipana or nativeness. That is the value of being Desi or native. Which value is inherent in any cultural object, belief, or practice, and which implies the natural state of sustaining the status quo. Nativism is thus establishing of one's right to exist as one is. Now, we can have critique of nativism, what we can find in Dilip Chavan's writing on Nemade's nativism in Muse India. Actually, Nemade introduced his concept of Deshivad or nativism during the early 1980s, but did not bother to elicit proper response outside the Marathi literary circles. Indian Institute of Advanced Study of Shimla has done a great job by inviting him to deliver lectures on nativism or Deshivad, which certainly compelled the highly devoted teacher in him to revise, restructure, systematize, elaborate, and illustrate his ideas available in stray essays. The outcome is the book on Nativism or Desivad in English. The well organized and extremely meticulous presentation of the concept in English will be of great help to the Indian scholars at the national and international level to read literary and critical works from a proper perspective. Many critics who had complaints against Nemade for not supporting his position by providing essential details in a systematic manner to their satisfaction will be silenced now. His position on 1. Nativism in literary culture, 2. Modernity, globalization and nativism, 3. Native style orality, and 4. The development of novel as a genre in India with special reference to Marathi novel 1857 to 1974 along with Katha Sarit Sagara and bilingual poetry is very much clear now. It certainly instigates the scholars to debate and discuss a number of issues to be tabled urgently in the academic circles, repeatedly getting indulged into explicating the hidden layers of meta-narratives of Marx, Freud, to of grammatology of Derrida to understand literature and its various aspects. Nemade expects us to look into our own tradition to form our own standards to judge the quality of literary work. So, our theory or our methodology of criticism will emerge from our own very literary practice. Among the critics who have sensed fully the potential of Nemade's position to offer viable literary tradition of our own are G.N. Devi and Makarand Paranjape. However, many more critics have reservations about its viability and raise questions about its relevance in changing times. Some of them hasten to stamp it as conservationist, traditional, separatist, narrow, and revivalist. Some Dalit critics read in it a Hindutva element. They lament that a progressive scholar like Nemade has fallen into the trap of Hindutva forces. How much substance such an allegation carries has to be assessed carefully. There is another class of critics which appears to be totally baffled to see the complex dynamics of his theory, searching for the space between Hullavalu of two extremes, Western and Sanskritic. To grasp this confusion in its fullest sense, we cannot afford to ignore the socio-historical elements operating behind it. Obviously, we need not labor much to illustrate that Brahminic dominance in all walks of life has spoiled the very fabric of a nation by establishing a monopoly of its obsolete ideas and thereby denying the basic human dignity to the larger mass. Worst of it was to regard certain sections of society as untouchables. Naturally, there is a strong resistance to any concept concomitant to Vedic parrotry or the self-righteous Brahminic worldview as holier than thou. Therefore, as a reaction to the oppressive Brahminic dominance, many scholars view Western knowledge systems as a liberating force. To them, except Buddhism, anything indigenous is synonymous with Brahminic. Hence, with all enthusiasm, they condemn it. Paradoxically, many nativistic forms of creations have been developed and preserved by lower sections of society. Interestingly enough, Nemade draws our attention towards the role played by lower sections of society in keeping the traditions alive. He regards Brahmin-dominated Hindu society as an example of nativistic narcissism and warns that if a delicate demarcation line between fundamentalism and nativism is not maintained, it may serve best to fundamentalists and fanatics. On the basis of this, can we really raise questions about the credentials of Nemade? Can we really say that Nemade's nativism or Deshivad is the extension of Brahminic hegemony? Does the nativism really carry some Hindutva element? The book on nativism answers most of these questions. Nemade refutes all the charges and leads his argument further to question reliability of Western ideas which originated from tiny island cultures with little history to claim and very few classics in literature to form the standards which can be applied universally to the literary works springing from altogether different cultures. I unquote. Now, from this long quotation of critic Dilip Chevade, we can understand that there are a whole lot of criticism against Nemade's idea of nativism, especially where the Dalit movement is very strong, and Dalit movement brought a radical change and gave new shape to Marathi literature. And Dalit aesthetics emerged as aesthetics of modern India, or the aesthetic contribution of India after the ancient or medieval era. So, to the Dalits, nativism is kind of Brahminic literary theory, as they do not regard any other religious philosophy or literary philosophy other than Buddhism. But as Dilip Chevade suggested us, that we have to assess this argument very carefully, because there were a long tradition of Bhakti movement, what observed the emergence of lower caste talent, people from the lower and marginal section of India. And when we are talking about nativism, we are actually talking about that glorious past of medieval India, because medieval India only observed the emergence of modern Indian languages. So when Nemade is talking about the Marathi literature, talking about Katha Sarit Sagara or the bilingual poet, we can have reference from the medieval India when the modern Indian languages emerged in its full-fledged, and modern Indian language wrote so many literary texts. So our nativism brought us back to that history of literature, to that culture of creation of new genre, method of writing literature, writing history, writing biography, autobiography, charita, etc., what we found in medieval Indian culture. So it is not appropriate to brand the nativism of Bhalchandra Nemade as Brahminic and keep it aside, because we are proud of it that nativism as a theory, along with Dalitism and Dalit aesthetics, is a contribution of modern India to the world of aesthetics, or to the world aesthetics thought and theories. So what criticism is there against nativism of Bhalchandra Nemade can actually revive the whole idea of nativism and can reshape the whole idea of nativism, because this is the era when we are looking for our past, our history, our identity, our ancestors. We are looking for the new methodology of analyzing our literature. We are looking for new theories to understand our literature and our literary past. So in this regard, nativism is very significant concept and philosophy to understand ourselves, to understand India, and that India is not restricted to any particular caste or any particular class, but we can have approach across the classes and across the caste. Especially nativism is very significant, very necessary idea to understand tribal literature, Dalit literature, and the folk literature produced since thousands of years in Indian literary history. Thank you.